time passes. Folks say that when things are going well, time goes faster. When things are bad, it goes slower. I can see that, but sometimes I think time makes its own decisions about things. I can't tell you how much time has passed here, in the dripping dark. I can't tell you what time has done, if it all just happened yesterday, or if it all happened years ago. Or, I don't know, if it hasn't happened yet. I want to tell about Sammy, about when he disappeared. I want to get to that part of the story, but the thing is, we only notice someone is gone when time has passed. It's like the clock is ticking, all normal, then it skips a beat, and we look up. And we didn't actually hear anything happen, but something inside of us noticed it. Something made us sit up and wonder. It wasn't quite like that with Sammy, not exactly. It wasn't a small missing beat, though for a musical director that would have made some sense, in a funny way. But this wasn't funny. It started 2 weeks after I got my tuxedo, after Mr. Drew had invited me to the party. I was on my way down to my least favorite part of the studio, the music department, when I ran into that strange violinist I'd met on my first day. I'd never learned her name. The musicians weren't around much, and anyway, she gave me the willies. She always looked haunted. Her hair was still a sheet of black, and she wore that long black skirt and sweater, even though, yeah, maybe the weather was a degree cooler now that it was September, but it really wasn't that much better. She didn't stop. I wasn't even sure she noticed me. She sidestepped me and kept on going, and that was it. But later in the day, I heard Dave of all people talking about how the musicians had been locked out of the music room. "What's the big deal?" Richie had asked, pushing up a wrinkled sleeve and scratching his bicep. "Get a master key." "They did. Seems like something was barricading the door," Dave replied. We all looked at him. The old man never spoke, never seemed to remember we were here. "All I know," he added, and then, like a switch had shut off, he was back to work, flipping between his 2 pages, making sure the change in the drawings of Boris's arm from cell to cell was just right. "There must be more to that story," Jacob said to me. "Something to do with ink," I imagined, but didn't say out loud, because that was a bizarre thing for someone to say. 3 days after that, when enough time had passed, but not so much that people really noticed it, Toby from accounting mentioned that Sammy hadn't come in for his paycheck. Again, us workers only knew anything about this because Mr. Drew himself was storming around the building, angrily muttering about it, interrogating folks he met as he went. I didn't feel like the rage matched the situation, but then I figured maybe he had something more on his mind than just a missing music director.
"It's the machine,"
said Dot as we were eating lunch. "What about it?" I asked. She always just said things out of the blue like that.
"Something's not working right. I heard him yelling at Tom."
"He's yelling at everyone," I replied.
"Yes, but trust me. We want answers, we need to find that machine," she said. I couldn't exactly tell her how I wasn't interested in investigating any further, how the creature near the infirmary didn't make me curious anymore, just made me want to stay away. After going to the suit shop with Mr. Drew, all I wanted was to draw and show Mr. Drew what I could do. I just wanted to work. But then Sammy went missing, officially. He'd been gone for over a week, but when the police showed up and started talking to folks, that's when we realized it was more than just someone taking a day off. The questions were straightforward. When was the last time you saw him? And that's when I remembered that the last time was the time he'd stormed into the art department looking for ink. That made me very uncomfortable. But then things took a turn. I remember coming to work and the police were outside and the studio was shut down. I remember being told by Richie that someone had broken in and messed the place up, that they were looking into a possible burglary.
I remember Mr. Drew rushing from his car and shouting in the detective's face something about sabotage, how seeing him shout like that was worse than seeing Mr. Schwartz lose his temper. Than seeing even Sammy lose his temper. It was jarring and a little scary, especially compared to how he usually seemed. I remember finding Dot in all the mess, or maybe she found me.
"Do you think it's a burglary, buddy?"
She asked. "Of course not," I said, sounding more sure than I felt.
"So you'll come with me tonight, when everyone's left, to check it out,"
she said. She didn't even ask. If she'd asked, I'd probably have said no. Then again, I still could have told her I didn't want to. She had no power over me. The fact was, despite my concerns, I was still curious. But it was more than that. Seeing Mr. Drew so upset, seeing him shake with rage and locked out of his own studio, well, it made me want to fix things. And if Dot and I could figure out what had happened, solve the mystery, he'd appreciate that. I had ambition, after all. And Dot had a key. The police barricades were still up that evening. There were no police, though. No one around to guard the studio. "Do we really want to do this?" I asked. I couldn't draw a more ominous-looking scene if I tried. Which at this point, well, I was beginning to figure my efforts at drawing weren't all that impressive. Still, the dark looming exterior, the do not enter sign, the fact even that the street lamp overhead was dark, a burnt-out bulb or something. Dot didn't really care about atmosphere. In the real world, that is.
"Ready?"
she asked. She slipped easily under the tape, crossing the front door, and had the door unlocked before I even made it across the street running after her. She was little, but quick. Inside, the studio reminded me a lot of the first time I'd seen it, when there had been that blackout. It made me feel strangely better, because it was familiar, but it didn't make me feel all that safe or anything. Dot turned on a flashlight. Because she'd brought a flashlight, because she always thought ahead like that.
"I don't think we should turn any lights on. We don't want to draw attention to the building,"
she said, as she started walking.
"And keep away from the windows, okay?"
"Yes," I said, which wasn't quite the right thing to say, but I was feeling so uneasy now. I knew Dot was confident that Sammy was behind everything strange and creepy in the studio, and I wanted to trust her, like I did with most things, but I couldn't forget the breathing on my face, the large handprint on my shirt. It didn't make sense to me that any of it was, well, human. It also didn't make sense to me that it wouldn't be either. I didn't want to scare her, though, and I didn't want to scare myself. But I was afraid of what hid in the dark corners. We stepped into the elevator. It was a strange experience, feeling the motion but seeing only Dot and part of the ceiling lit. It was hard to believe we were moving at all. Dot didn't say anything, but looked as determined as ever, holding the flashlight just below shoulder height. Her glasses created large shadows around her eyes, framing them so it looked like she was wearing a mask. She was a superhero. The elevator clanged to a stop, and we stepped out into the dark hall. Here we go again, I thought. We walked that familiar hallway, and Dot shone the light around to see more than just where we were going.
"Buddy, look,"
she said. Her light had caught the glint of something on the wall. She got closer, but didn't have to. I knew what it was.
"Ink,"
she said. She traced it with her flashlight down the wall, farther away from us. The light grew and revealed thick trails of ink, like a hand had been dragged along it, but bigger. There were large spatters toward the end of the wall, like someone had thrown buckets of ink at it, dumped it on the ground and splashed it everywhere.
"No wonder they shut everything down. I don't even know how they'd start to clean this up. This is someone who's angry," said Dot.
Do you think Sammy did this? I asked.
Who else?
She started walking again. I didn't think Sammy did this. I was feeling more sure by the moment. Sammy hadn't done all this and then just disappeared. Something else had done this, and then done something to Sammy. Just as I had thought that, I heard it. Now I wonder if it did actually happen that way. That I thought it and then heard the breathing. Maybe I had heard the breathing first. That would make more sense. I'm not that clever. At first, I thought it was my mind playing tricks on me, like the ink slipping down the paper, but then Dot stopped and said, "Shh." And I knew she heard it too. We stopped walking and stood in complete silence. Except we couldn't stand in silence, not with the sound of wet breath stalking us from somewhere behind, not with the sudden thump on the ground, and another. I noticed then the light of Dot's flashlight was dimming. What a moment for the bulb to die. I turned to look and saw Dot's face illuminated by the glow, staring in horror as the shadows started to creep into the beam. It could have been water pooling around us, but I knew it wasn't. Another thump, and another. The breathing got louder and louder. The light got dimmer and dimmer. "Run!" I whispered loudly and gave Dot a push. I didn't even think about it, I just did it, and she ran. Didn't ask why, didn't try to come up with a better plan, she just ran, and I ran. The light that was left bounced off the walls, making it hard to tell which direction we were going. It glanced off a poster and suddenly Bendy was grinning at us like he'd jumped out from behind the corner. I gasped, but the poster was soon behind us, just like the breathing that was getting louder and louder, panting. A large, heavy animal chasing us and catching up. I barely saw the word music before Dot called out, "Over here!" We launched ourselves at the door to the music room and, however we got inside, however we got through, we were in, and the door slammed shut behind us. I leaned hard against it, out of breath, terror flowing from every pore.
"Buddy, look,"
said Dot quietly but urgently. She was pointing the flashlight at my feet. I looked down. The shadows were seeping their way under the door, and her light flickered again. I pushed myself away from the door fast, tripping into the room and into Dot, who stumbled a bit. I grabbed her hand instinctively to keep track of her. She didn't fight me. Her light flashed up to the wall, still flickering. More ink. Then she turned to shine her light on the room. Broken chairs and stands, instruments scattered all over the place, and ink. Ink everywhere.
"Can you hear it?"
she whispered. I can't hear it. I strained my ears to listen for the wet breathing, for the footsteps. "No, aim at the door again," I whispered back. She did, and gasped. We both staggered back instantly, still holding on to each other. The black shadows were even longer and seemed to be reaching now, almost like they were climbing up the beam of the flashlight, like fingers trying to grab us. "Turn it off! Turn it off!" I said in a panic. I could hear her fumble with the flashlight, and then there was a click. We stood there, in the pitch dark. The only breathing I could hear was hers and mine. I clenched my body tight, bracing myself for the shadows to find us, to wrap themselves around us. Nothing happened.
"What was that?"
Dot asked in a frantic whisper. "It was the thing. It's the thing from the infirmary," I whispered back, trying desperately to answer and also not make a noise.
"I don't understand,"
whispered Dot, her hand shaking in mine.
"It doesn't make sense. The shadows, the sounds."
"Shh." She was quiet instantly. I didn't know what I'd heard, but something had sparked my senses. I closed my eyes. Even though it was pitch black, I closed my eyes, trying to hear through the darkness, as if the darkness itself was thick and muffling sound. So quiet. Too quiet.
"Do you think it's gone?"
asked Dot. Crash. We both screamed. "Turn on the light," I said, and there was a panicked movement from behind me as Dot fumbled with the flashlight. The beam was dim, so dim as it fell upon the floor, but there was enough to catch the figure covered in thick ink on the ground in front of us.
"Buddy,"
gasped Dot. I leaned down. I had done this before. I was experiencing the same thing before, in the music room, bending over a figure covered in ink. The head jerked and I fell back into Dot. She stumbled, and the light wavered for a moment. I stared at the figure. It was propping itself up by its hands, its elbows bent and shoulder blades protruding. A curtain of hair fell over the face, dripping now in ink, like the hair itself was ink. I knew that hair. "He's here," rasped a familiar voice. The head twisted suddenly, and then its body collapsed into a sickening thud against the wood.
"What is that?"
asked Dot, her voice high and shaking. "The violinist," I replied, barely able to get the words out.
"Who?"
I reached toward Dot. I needed the flashlight. I needed it. I was in full panic, and all I knew was he was here. It was here. Somehow, Dot understood and put the flashlight in my shaking hand. I aimed it around the room wildly, barely taking a moment to see that the corners were empty, ignoring the reaching shadows, the dimming of the light, the flicker. Every direction, every way possible, I aimed down and all around and back to the door, and the chaos in the room just made it all like a fever dream, like I was dizzy. Nothing. No one. I stopped, the faint beam landing again on the violinist.
"Where did she come from?"
whispered Dot.
"She couldn't have just appeared."
I shook my head. No idea. It's like she was just... I didn't finish my thought. There was a pause, and then Dot completed my sentence.
"Dropped."
Slowly, and with a deep intake of breath, I turned the flickering faint beam up above us and looked. Something wet, black, dripping. A figure with something sharp that glinted in the light, like teeth. And then the flashlight died in the shadows.